God's eye view. God sees me, God sees you, God sees all of us in a God's eye view. What is a God's eye view? Well, within film and television, it is that view from above. It's the shot that comes down. It's the drone shot that we see in commercials and movies and TV. And so we may wonder at times, how does God see us? And that also helps us to understand maybe how do we see one another? And then also, how do we see our own suffering? How do we see it from God's point of view? So last week we had started the book of Job, one of the oldest stories in the Bible. It asked that question that we all may ask at different times in our lives, but humans have been asking it as long as we've been able to speak and write. Why do good things happen? Why do bad things happen to good people? Why is it that we suffer? Why does God allow our suffering? And then also, why does God let evil exist? So in the book of Job, we have they're asking these questions that Job himself is asking them, and that it starts off in this heavenly court, and we have God Almighty within his throne. And then we have all the different angels and evil spirits coming before the Lord. And we have Satan, and Satan means the accuser. So the accuser who's always accusing you of things that you may or may not have done. It's like those who gossip and have no idea what's really going on. Because that's what gossip is you're judging somebody, but you don't always have all the facts. So there's Satan making up lies, also coming up with different ways to test us. And yet we know that God allows this to happen. And that's why it's talked about as a test. And so Satan asks God, let me test Job, considered a righteous man. A righteous man who was wealthy, who had a large family. And last week we talked about how that is one of the greatest challenges that humans struggle with, is when their children suffer. And unfortunately, some parents have to watch their children suffer greatly. No matter what they do, they can't seem to get some relief or get answers. Sometimes asking God, God, what are you doing? Why aren't you doing something to help my child? Why is it that evil goes after the most innocent? It's one of the heart-wrenching questions we may ask, and it leads many of us to our knees to ask God to do something. And I know that feeling. Many of you may know that same thing. And that's part of our own struggle, is like, what is the difference between struggling and suffering? We talk about this all the time, but I think that it's something that we should continue to explore, because we all will suffer in some ways that we have no control over. And then there are times where we have choices. God bless you. So struggling is that we have choices that we can try and get out of the suffering, that we don't have to suffer as much, because sometimes it's our choices that allow us to suffer more. Especially if we know we shouldn't do certain things. And so we are encouraged with God's help to know what we need to do to persevere, to endure, to not let ourselves fall into the victim mode, to not give in to fear and despair, to hold on to faith and hope. Because the other is just desolation. If we give in to fear and depression, then it takes us down. It takes us out. So that's why the struggle sometimes is between our own ears, within our own souls. And so we seek God's help in saying, you're allowing this, but I'm going to pray against it. I don't know if you saw that video of the woman when the hurricanes were coming and she was praying against the hurricane. Did you see this? And it was coming over her town and she was praying.